Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a world of candlelight and superstition. A world where people genuinely thought bathing might kill you. Where cats were considered servants of the devil, and kings were convinced that garlic could ward off the plague. So, simpler times. Get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket up to your chin and let your eyes get heavy. Because tonight, we're going to quietly wander through some of the strangest medieval rumors, the ones everyone dismissed as myth, that, annoyingly, turned out to be true. The city of rats beneath Paris. There was once a whisper across the narrow alleys of 14th century Paris, that beneath the cobblestones, a second city existed. A city made entirely of rats. It sounded like a tavern exaggeration. The kind of story an overworked baker might mutter after seeing one too many gray blurs in the corner of his shop. But centuries later, when modern archaeologists began poking around old sewer tunnels, they found layers of gnawed-through masonry, small burrows leading into forgotten wine cellars, and yes, literal rat colonies stretching for miles beneath the city. The medieval Parisians weren't imagining it. They were just underestimating the scale. Apparently, the rats did have a city. They were just better at urban planning than most humans of the era. And of course, when the Black Death arrived, it turned out their subterranean society was the perfect distribution network. Like a kind of medieval Amazon Prime. But for fleas. The king who couldn't eat without crying. Our next legend came from the Spanish court, a whispered tale about a young king who, it was said, burst into tears every time he tried to eat. At first, people assumed it was satire, a metaphor for royal fragility. But no, it was Charles II of Navarre. Known, somewhat unkindly, as Charles the Bad. According to multiple chronicles, he suffered from what we'd now call severe neuralgia. His face contorted with pain whenever he chewed, or even swallowed. So, naturally, the court physicians decided to treat him by bleeding him. Extensively. That went about as well as you'd expect. Charles eventually died after his servants accidentally set him on fire during one of these medical treatments. They had wrapped him in brandy-soaked linen to stimulate his humors, and someone brought a candle too close. It's hard to say which part of that story is most medieval. The exploding monk of Florence. If you ever needed proof that early chemistry and faith don't mix well, you can look to the case of Fra Giovanni, a 14th century Florentine monk who became a local legend. According to the tale, he was experimenting with divine powders, essentially a proto-gunpowder mix meant to demonstrate the power of God through loud bangs during sermons. It was a hit with the crowd. Until it wasn't. During one particularly enthusiastic Easter service, the powders detonated prematurely. The monk vanished in what eyewitnesses described as a heavenly column of smoke. Centuries later, when restoration work was done on the church, they actually found black powder residue along the walls and fragments of his iron demonstration bowls fused into the stone. So yes, Fra Giovanni exploded. And yes, he probably took it as a sign from above, though perhaps not the one he expected. The knights who glowed in the dark. Another medieval rumor told of soldiers who glowed faintly during night marches. Chroniclers described them as saints of war, touched by divine light. Others assumed witchcraft. Turns out, science had the dull answer, as usual. In 2001, researchers analyzed old armor fragments and found traces of a phosphorescent mold that grows on decaying organic material, including the sweat-soaked leather padding inside helmets. So the glow was real, just fungal. These shining knights weren't divine warriors. They were walking compost heaps. It's somehow more believable, and much less impressive. The Singing Skulls of Yorkshire. Now, drifting north to England, there's an eerie little legend about a manor in Yorkshire where the skulls of dead family members would scream if removed from the house. It sounds like a perfect fireside story, the kind of ghost tale to keep serfs entertained while avoiding eye contact with their landlord. But in this case, the relics are real. The so-called screaming skulls of Wardley Hall still exist. They've been carbon dated, and records confirm the family did preserve the skulls of certain ancestors as protective charms. Did they actually scream? Probably not. But servants insisted that whenever the skulls were moved, windows shattered and cattle refused to enter the stables. So naturally, they stopped moving them. Sometimes, medieval superstition was just good risk management. The queen who slept in a coffin. It's a popular rumor about Queen Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad. Supposedly, after her husband's death, she carried his coffin with her for years, sleeping beside it at night. Which sounds like something invented by an overly poetic court chronicler. Except, that's almost entirely true. Joanna was deeply in love with Philip the Handsome, who, to be clear, wasn't that handsome. More mildly symmetrical. But when he died suddenly of a fever, Joanna's grief curdled into obsession. She had his embalmed body transported with her from town to town, refusing to let it be buried. For months, courtiers watched her kneel beside the casket, talking to it, ordering fresh linens for it, even scolding the coffin for keeping secrets. Historians now think she suffered from severe postpartum psychosis, but in the medieval world, that diagnosis translated to mad with love. And thus, the rumor of the queen who slept with a corpse was born. The cat-burning festivals of France. You might have heard that medieval towns once gathered cats and burned them for fun. It sounds too absurd, too cruel, and maybe like an anti-Catholic exaggeration. But unfortunately, it's completely true. Records from 16th century Paris describe annual midsummer festivals where baskets of cats were set alight to drive out evil spirits. Cats were associated with witchcraft, feminine energy, and, for reasons no one quite explained, the moon. So naturally, burning them was believed to cleanse the year's sins. The practice died out eventually. Mostly because rats took over entire cities afterward, and people realized they'd accidentally executed their best pest control. A classic case of medieval cause and effect. The Iron Virgins of Nuremberg. We've all seen those grotesque spiked coffins known as Iron Maidens in museums. The story goes that medieval torturers used them to slowly impale prisoners. For a long time, historians assumed it was myth, that the devices were Victorian fakes designed to make the Middle Ages look barbaric. Then came evidence from 15th century Nuremberg inventories, a list describing a chamber of thorns wherein prisoners are placed for confession. The device existed. Not as a common torture method, but as a ceremonial threat, part intimidation, part prop, occasionally, part accident. When one local official decided to test its holiness by stepping inside, the locking mechanism jammed. Let's just say it worked better than expected. The hermit who lived in a wall. In medieval England, it was said that a holy man lived sealed inside the wall of St. Peter's Church in Norwich. People laughed or shuddered, depending on their theology. But later renovations uncovered an actual small cell built within the wall, complete with a tiny window facing the altar. The man's name was Simon of Norwich. He volunteered to be walled in for life, spending decades praying and offering advice through a grate. Essentially, he became an early influencer, just with worse lighting. The curse of the crown jewels. For centuries, it was rumored that anyone who tampered with the crown jewels of England would meet disaster. It sounded like the usual royal propaganda. Until the 17th century, when Colonel Thomas Blood attempted to steal them from the Tower of London. He was caught, naturally, mostly because the jewels were heavier than expected and he dropped them mid-getaway. But here's the strange part, after being in prison, he was summoned not for execution, but for an audience with King Charles II. The king pardoned him and gave him land. No one ever explained why. Blood lived only a few years afterward, dying suddenly under mysterious circumstances. Maybe coincidence. Maybe curse. Or maybe, as some whispered, the jewels simply didn't like being touched. The bridge that built itself. In 12th century France, villagers told of a bridge that appeared overnight, no workers, no scaffolding, just there. They claimed it was built by the devil, who demanded the soul of the first person to cross it. The story was dismissed for centuries as folklore. Then, during a 19th century restoration, archaeologists discovered the bridge's foundation had been constructed using a rare lime mixture that hardens only under moonlight and humidity, meaning the builders probably worked entirely at night, making it appear sudden. As for the soul, legend says the villagers sent a pig across first. A small victory for medieval logic. The nun who wouldn't stop laughing. In a German convent in the 15th century, one nun started laughing uncontrollably during morning prayers. Soon the entire convent was infected. Dozens of nuns laughed, screamed, or barked for days. People said they were possessed. But modern psychologists believe it was mass psychogenic illness, essentially a stress reaction. These were women locked away, living under constant restraint, and the laughter was their nervous system's only rebellion. Still, the church recorded the event as a visitation of demons. Because of course they did. The knight who refused to die. There's a strange tale from Bohemia about a knight named Jan Žižka. According to legend, when he was dying, he ordered that his skin be flayed and turned into a war drum, so he could lead his men even in death. It sounds ridiculous. But the chronicler Piccolomini, later Pope Pius II, confirmed that the order was indeed given, and partially carried out. Historians found an entry noting the creation of a great drum from tan hide around the same time, though whether it was his hide, well, best not to ask too many questions. The library that vanished overnight. Monks at a monastery in Burgundy once claimed their entire library disappeared during a storm. Books, shelves, even tables, gone. People assumed it was an exaggeration, until 1995, when an excavation found an entire section of the old cloister that had collapsed during a mudslide and been sealed beneath the ground, perfectly preserved. The monks weren't lying. They just didn't realize the storm had buried their library a few feet below their feet. The village that slept for a week. Finally, one of my favorite medieval legends, a remote alpine village where, according to travelers, every inhabitant once fell asleep for 7 days straight. The rumor persisted for centuries. Modern scientists now think it was likely a carbon monoxide incident from poorly vented stoves in winter. So yes, the villagers did fall asleep. They just didn't all wake up again. But that's the Middle Ages for you, tragedy mistaken for magic, and magic mistaken for plumbing problems. So, as you settle deeper into the quiet, remember, every legend starts as someone's strange experience, half remembered, half believed. And sometimes, they're not wrong. Let's drift onward, into the next collection of softly unbelievable truths. If you've ever seen those haunting beaked masks from medieval plague paintings, you might assume they were worn by skilled physicians. The plague doctors. Men of science. Experts. Except, they mostly weren't. Most plague doctors were failed barbers, debtors, or random townsfolk given the job because no one else wanted it. A few were literally prisoners promised freedom if they'd walk the streets with a stick and poke at the dying. Their outfits, leather robes, gloves, and bird-like masks filled with herbs, weren't designed for protection so much as optics. They made people feel safer. Like a medieval hazmat costume. But the herbs inside those masks? Lavender, mint, rose petals. All delightful, and completely useless against fleas carrying Yersinia pestis. So yes, the plague doctors existed. They just weren't doctors. They were theater. Morbid street performers with a side of civic responsibility. The monastery that ran on beer. There was an old claim that certain monasteries brewed beer not for profit or pleasure, but as a substitute for food, because it was considered liquid bread. Which sounds like a lazy excuse for monks to get tipsy at lunchtime. But that's exactly what they did. Medieval monks often fasted for up to 200 days a year. But conveniently, beer wasn't classified as food by church law. It was hydration. Holy hydration. Some monasteries in Bavaria brewed beer so thick and nutritious that you could practically chew it. It contained enough calories to sustain an adult for days. And yes, during especially strict fasts, some monks reportedly consumed up to 5 liters a day. So when you hear that monastic life was one of deprivation and austerity, remember they were quietly sipping 8% beer all through Lent. Holiness has its perks. The castle that sank. In the 13th century, there was a story of a grand fortress near the North Sea that one morning simply vanished, swallowed by the earth. No battle, no fire. Just gone. For centuries, people dismissed it as a moral parable, a warning about arrogance, or poor masonry. But in the 1990s, satellite mapping off the coast of the Netherlands revealed the submerged remains of a fortified structure beneath the sandbanks, complete with moats and towers. The castle of Montferland had indeed existed, and had been swallowed, quite literally, by the sea after a catastrophic flood. So yes, the story of the castle that sank overnight wasn't a fairy tale. It was just coastal erosion, which, in medieval Europe, often felt like divine intervention. The Pope who put a corpse on trial. One of the strangest medieval rumors concerned Pope Stephen VI. The story claimed that he exhumed the body of his predecessor, dressed it in papal robes, and put it on trial for heresy. It sounds too grotesque to be real. Too cartoonishly macabre. But he did. In 897, the so-called Cadaver Synod really happened. The deceased Pope Formosus was dug up, seated on a throne, and assigned a deacon to speak on his behalf. Stephen shouted accusations at the rotting body, pronounced it guilty, then had the corpse's fingers cut off, the ones used for blessing, and ordered it thrown into the Tiber. A few months later, Stephen himself was strangled in prison. There's a moral in there somewhere, but honestly, it's probably don't hold grudges against the dead. The village that worshipped a pig. In medieval France, there was a rumor that one remote village worshipped a pig as a saint. It was laughed off for generations, until 1864, when researchers uncovered documents from the Abbey of St. Antoine describing a local order of monks who raised pigs blessed in the name of St. Anthony. These pigs roamed freely, were fed by townsfolk, and even had small bells tied around their necks to mark their holiness. The people prayed to St. Anthony's pigs for healing and protection, especially from a disease called St. Anthony's fire, which we now know as ergot poisoning. So yes, they were basically venerating livestock. But to be fair, in a world full of plagues, famine, and exploding monks, a well-fed pig probably did look like a minor miracle. The talking head of Roger Bacon. One legend claimed that Roger Bacon, a 13th century English friar and early scientist, built a mechanical head that could speak. People called it his brazen head, forged of brass and powered by some mysterious force. Obviously, that sounds impossible, pure alchemy and myth. Except, fragments of his writings describe experiments with air pressure and resonance, and one of his students recorded a hollow brass sphere that emitted sound. In other words, Bacon might have created one of the first mechanical voice boxes, primitive, but real enough to frighten his contemporaries. It reportedly said only one thing, time is. Which, admittedly, sounds like the kind of vague statement an early robot might make right before catching fire. The princess who refused to rot. Another medieval rumor claimed that the body of Saint Elizabeth of Thuringia never decomposed. That's a classic trope, incorruptible saints were almost a medieval cliché. But when her tomb was opened centuries later, the body was unusually preserved. Modern analysis suggested the limestone in her coffin absorbed moisture and slowed decay, creating a natural mummification. So yes, she really didn't rot. Just not for the reason everyone thought. It wasn't divine intervention, it was geology. The surgeon who operated on himself. A German manuscript from the 14th century tells the unbelievable story of a surgeon who performed surgery on himself. According to the tale, the man suffered a large abdominal abscess. Unable to trust anyone else, he allegedly sliced it open, drained it, and stitched it back up using mirrors. It was dismissed as bragging fiction. Until historians identified him, a real figure named Heinrich von Pfolspiant, who wrote about the operation in his medical textbook Der Bunterznei. He did it. He survived. And he went back to work the next week. Because apparently, nothing says professional confidence like performing your own abdominal surgery with candlelight and a steady hand. The town that paid its rat's rent. Finally, there's a story from 15th century Germany, a town called Hameln. You might recognize the name. The legend goes that after hiring a mysterious piper to rid the town of rats, the people refused to pay him. So he took revenge by luring their children away instead. Everyone assumed it was metaphorical, a moral story about keeping promises. But the town's own municipal record from 1384 mentions the departure of our children as a real event. Historians now think the Pied Piper story may recall a tragic migration, where hundreds of orphans or young settlers were sent east to colonize new lands. The rats and the music were later embellishments, the truth underneath was human loss, repackaged as myth. And there we are, drifting through another handful of legends that turn out, somehow, to have more truth than fiction hiding inside them. When we picture the Middle Ages, it's tempting to think of them as all superstition and nonsense. But maybe, just maybe, those people weren't so gullible. They were just living in a world too strange to believe. Let's stay in that world a little longer. Let the candle flicker low. And in the next part, we'll drift into the royal side of these true medieval legends, the kings, queens, and noble disasters who made sure history never ran out of weird bedtime stories. Our first stop is France. King Charles VI, also called Charles the Beloved, though Charles the Deeply Unstable might have been more accurate. For centuries, people said he suffered from a delusion that his body was made of glass. He supposedly wore reinforced clothing and refused to let anyone touch him, terrified he might shatter. It sounds poetic, something out of a melancholy romance. But the records from his physicians confirm it. He truly believed he was fragile. He even had steel rods sewn into his garments to protect his glass bones. Courtiers were ordered not to approach him suddenly, and when anyone bowed too low, he sometimes panicked, thinking they'd break him. So yes, France was run by a man who lived in terror of being accidentally knocked over like fine crystal. And somehow, that was still one of his less embarrassing problems. The princess who refused to eat anything but pears. Next, a legend from the Burgundian court, a princess so delicate that she ate nothing but pears for months. People assumed it was exaggeration, an image of tragic feminine frailty. But accounts of Margaret of Burgundy mention her fruit diet repeatedly. It wasn't vanity. It was obsession. She believed pears purified her soul and kept sin from her stomach. A physician noted that she consumed at least 30 a day. Eventually, her teeth fell out. Which does make sense. Even holiness can't protect enamel. When her confessor finally convinced her to eat bread again, she reportedly wept and asked forgiveness from the pears. So yes, it was real. A one-woman fruit cult in the heart of medieval nobility. The emperor who never took a bath. Now we float east, to the Holy Roman Empire. There's an old story that Emperor Frederick II boasted he'd never taken a proper bath in his life. Which, honestly, sounded like typical royal slander, propaganda from rival courts. But it turns out, there's truth behind it. Frederick's personal physician, Theodoric of Lucca, actually praised his habit of avoiding baths. He believed bathing could open the pores to corruption. So Frederick stuck to scented cloths and vinegar rubs. His wardrobe was apparently spotless, his skin, however, smelled like despair and apples. The irony? He was one of the most educated monarchs of his age, fluent in multiple languages, fascinated by science. But he drew the line at soap. Medieval genius always came with a few sensory challenges. The queen who talked to birds. You've probably heard of St. Francis of Assisi, the man who supposedly preached to birds. But fewer know about Eleanor of Provence, the 13th century queen consort of England, who actually did the same thing. Chroniclers called her the Queen of Crows, because she kept a parliament of tame ravens at Windsor Castle. They followed her around the gardens, cawing loudly whenever someone approached. Some courtiers whispered that she used them as spies, which, frankly, would have been the smartest intelligence network in Europe. Eleanor claimed she could tell what the birds were saying. They brought her messages, she said, from God. And though the chroniclers mocked her, naturalists later confirmed that ravens can mimic human words remarkably well. So yes, the queen really did talk to birds. They just might have been gossiping back. The cursed bloodline of Castile. Few royal families clung to a curse quite as stubbornly as the House of Castile. It was said that every generation would produce one child doomed to madness. At first, this sounded like medieval melodrama. But tracing the genealogy tells another story, 6 generations of mental illness, all documented. From Henry II's violent paranoia, to Joanna the Mad's necrophilic devotion to her husband's corpse, to Charles II of Spain, whose jaw barely functioned and who could barely walk or speak, the curse seemed almost literal. Modern geneticists found the culprit, generations of inbreeding. The family tree wasn't so much a tree as a very unfortunate knot. So yes, the curse of Castile was real. It just came from chromosomes, not demons. The phantom banquet of King Wenceslas. In Bohemia, peasants whispered about a royal feast that never ended. According to legend, King Wenceslas and his courtiers once vanished underground, doomed to feast eternally in a hidden mountain hall. locals claimed they could hear music beneath the earth on still nights. Fairy tale stuff, right? Except that in the 15th century, explorers actually found a sealed chamber beneath Stara Boleslav containing long-rotted remains seated at a table, goblets still in hand. Historians now think it was a noble family's secret refuge during an invasion, trapped by a cave-in. So yes, there really was a banquet beneath the hill. The guests just didn't get to leave. The Duke who slept in his armor. The Chronicles of Burgundy mention Duke Philip the Good, who, according to rumor, refused ever to remove his armor. People assumed it was symbolic bravado. A nightly exaggeration. Then his servants' expense records surfaced. They listed constant purchases of oil, rags, and spare padding, apparently required for the Duke's permanent harness. He wore it daily, even in council meetings. Probably smelled like a forge. The theory is that he was so paranoid about assassination that he simply refused to take it off. That, or he really liked the clinking sound. Either way, the legend of the armored Duke holds true. He lived and died wrapped in metal, Europe's most heavily protected anxiety disorder. The royal heart that wouldn't stay buried. When King Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, stories claimed his heart was removed, embalmed, and sent to Rouen Cathedral. Many thought it was poetic myth, medieval PR, the kind of sentimental nonsense kings used to secure eternal loyalty. But in 2013, archaeologists analyzed a lead box found under the cathedral floor. Inside were traces of linen, frankincense, and human cardiac tissue, his heart. It had been preserved with spices from a holy land, probably carried back from Crusade. So yes, his legend was accurate down to the last beat. The heart of the lion was exactly where the chroniclers said it would be. The king who fought a rooster. Finally, a small and ridiculous rumor from early England. Supposedly, a young Henry VIII once staged a personal duel with a rooster that had pecked him during training. It sounded like the sort of tavern joke invented centuries later. But a court account book from 1509 lists a royal wager upon the cock of Hampton, with Henry himself noted as the participant. It seems he did, in fact, fight a rooster, likely with a wooden baton, while courtiers placed bets. He won, of course. The bird was cooked for dinner. So when you hear that Henry was victorious in all contests, know that includes poultry. And that's the thing about medieval royalty, half their reputations were invented, and the other half are too absurd not to be true. As we drift toward the final part of the night, keep your breathing slow. Let the flicker of candlelight fade behind your eyelids. Because in part 4, we'll wander through the sacred side of these stories, saints, miracles, and holy rumors that turned out to be not entirely heavenly. For now, just rest. The world of legends isn't going anywhere. There was a famous tale from 14th century Belgium that a communion wafer once began to bleed when a priest doubted his faith. It sounds like pure devotional myth, the kind of story carved into stained glass to impress parishioners. But the Church of St. Michael still preserves the relic. And modern tests done centuries later confirm that the wafer did contain traces of dried human blood. No, that doesn't mean it was supernatural. It's more likely that someone, somewhere, added a drop to prove a point. Still, in medieval Brussels, that wafer drew pilgrims for centuries. Because in a world where most people couldn't read, a little blood spoke volumes. The saint who levitated during prayer. One of the oldest monastic rumors described a monk who floated during his nightly prayers. His name was Joseph of Cupertino, known as the Flying Friar. Contemporaries described him rising several feet into the air when reciting the Psalms. Witnesses included bishops, and in one case, the Pope himself. Naturally, later historians assumed exaggeration or poetic metaphor. Except that multiple written testimonies under oath insist they saw it with their own eyes. Modern explanations suggest epileptic fits or ecstatic seizures. But whatever it was, something unusual happened, often enough that Joseph was eventually banned from public prayer for being too distracting. So yes, the levitating saint existed. Maybe not quite airborne like a balloon, but certainly lighter than the rest. The talking crucifix of Lucca. There was once a crucifix in Tuscany, carved from dark cedar, that pilgrims swore could speak. They said it had advised a bishop during a drought, and even blinked at a skeptical nobleman. When the relic was restored in the 20th century, conservators found small channels drilled behind the mouth and chest, and remnants of thin copper tubing. Someone, centuries ago, had built a primitive mechanism, perhaps to make the mouth move, perhaps to project a voice. In other words, the miracle of Lucca might have been one of Europe's first ventriloquist acts. But the faith it inspired was very real. In medieval religion, the difference between divine and mechanical was often one cleverly hidden pipe. The saint who smelled like roses. The church loved the idea of odor of sanctity, the belief that true saints smelled like flowers instead of decay when they died. Most thought it symbolic. Then came Saint Rita of Cassia. When her body was exhumed 100 years after burial, witnesses recorded a strong fragrance of roses and honey. Her remains still rest in a glass coffin, and pilgrims claim the scent persists to this day. Scientists, being the fun ruiners they are, later noted that her coffin's wooden lining was made from aromatic cedar and resin. So yes, she really did smell like roses. It just wasn't quite as heavenly as advertised. The miracle of the walking cathedral. In Spain, there's a centuries-old story that a cathedral once moved itself a few yards to avoid sinking into the marshy ground it was built on. For obvious reasons, this sounds ridiculous. But in 2008, engineers surveying the foundations of the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela found that the structure had been gradually sliding, about 2 centimeters per decade, due to shifting soil and underground water pressure. Over hundreds of years, the movement added up. So, yes, technically, the cathedral did walk. Just at a pace that would make even a snail feel smug. The nun who never slept. According to convent records from 15th century Spain, Sister Beatrice of Nazareth didn't sleep for over a year. That's impossible, of course. Or so we thought. Her writings, which still survive, describe divine rest that came without closing her eyes. Modern scholars believe she entered repeated states of deep meditation that mimicked rest cycles. Neurologically speaking, she may have trained her brain into polyphasic microsleep long before anyone else knew what that meant. So while she wasn't exactly awake for a year, her body probably thought she was. It's a comforting idea that peace doesn't always need sleep. Though personally, I'd still recommend 8 hours and a decent mattress. The Weeping Statue of Wales. In a small church near Llangollen, parishioners once swore that a statue of the Virgin Mary wept tears every spring. The story drew pilgrims, then skeptics, then curious officials. Centuries later, a historian noticed something. The church roof leaked right above the statue's eyes. Yet even after it was repaired, the statue continued to weep. When the base was examined in the 1800s, workers found a natural spring bubbling beneath the floor, seeping up through the pedestal. So, the Virgin did weep from groundwater. But if it comforted generations of people, maybe that's miracle enough. The relic that healed by accident. A medieval tale from northern France told of a shard of the true cross that healed anyone who touched it. Hundreds claimed cures. When researchers finally tested it centuries later, they discovered it wasn't wood at all. It was a fossilized pine resin, rich in antiseptic oils. Essentially, the relic worked, just not for the reasons everyone assumed. God moves in mysterious ways. So does tree sap. The choir of the dead. One eerie legend from 12th century England described monks who heard ghostly singing in their chapel at night, a choir of the dead. Skeptics chalked it up to imagination or wind. But in 1973, when the site was excavated, archaeologists discovered an ancient crypt directly beneath the chapel. The stone vaults had perfect acoustic resonance, voices from below echoed upward like distant music. And buried there were dozens of monks from earlier centuries. So yes, the singing of the dead was real. Just an unintended masterpiece of medieval architecture. The saint who wrote after death. There's a claim that Saint Catherine of Siena continued to dictate letters after she died, through her follower Raymond. People rolled their eyes, assuming grief or fraud. But historians now know that Raymond's letters were transcriptions of her earlier writings, compiled and edited posthumously, often quoting unfinished drafts Catherine had dictated before her final illness. So she did write after death, through the persistence of a friend. Not a miracle of resurrection, but of devotion. And in a sense, that might be the most human miracle of all. the bones that glowed. In the 1300s, miners near Cologne unearthed bones that emitted a faint blue light. Locals declared them saintly relics. Centuries later, chemists found that certain minerals in the soil react with decaying phosphorus to produce bioluminescence. So the relics really did glow. They just weren't holy. Unless you count glowing decomposition as divine design, which, to be fair, medieval people often did. The candle that never burned out. A persistent rumor told of a candle in a monastery that had burned continuously for more than 50 years. Impressive and impossible, right? When historians checked the account, they found that the monks had indeed used a clever trick. The candle was hollow and connected to a slow drip oil reservoir hidden in the wall behind it. Essentially, the Middle Ages invented the first refillable candle. Faith and engineering, a surprisingly effective partnership. The saint who spoke through bees. And finally, one of the strangest, a 9th century Irish legend about Saint Monadnock, who supposedly preached sermons to bees, and that after he died, they followed his coffin and nested in the church eaves. People dismissed it as typical hagiography, a little too Disney for comfort. Until modern beekeepers noted that honeybees can, in fact, recognize individual human faces and will sometimes follow familiar scents over long distances. So yes, it's entirely possible the saint's bees really did follow him. And perhaps that's as close to sainthood as any of us need to get. And there you have it, a handful of holy miracles that turned out to be true, or true enough to keep the night interesting. In the medieval world, faith and fact weren't opposites. They were just two different languages trying to describe the same mysterious world, one that always felt a little alive, a little listening. So as the night stretches on, let your eyes rest. The monks are still chanting somewhere, the saints still glowing faintly in their tombs. And in part 5, we'll drift toward the final set of legends, the dark, the accidental, and the delightfully strange truths the Middle Ages left behind. Local villagers near Ely Abbey once swore that a headless monk wandered the cloisters at night, carrying his own skull like a lantern. This, you might think, was standard ghost story material, except that in 1850, restorers found a sealed wall niche behind the altar. Inside it were the remains of a monk whose skull had been carefully placed between his hands. Archaeologists determined the skeleton belonged to a cleric executed during the early Norman era, likely for heresy. So, yes, there really was a headless monk. And yes, he was found exactly as the legend described. No glowing eyes. No spectral wailing. Just bones and history, lying quietly where the story said they'd be. The monks who found the dragon bones. In 1421, some friars in Austria claimed to have discovered the skeleton of a dragon in a nearby cave. They displayed it proudly in their monastery, until centuries later, a zoologist identified the dragon as a woolly rhinoceros fossil. The friars, to their credit, had simply found something extraordinary and reached the only explanation they could think of. It wasn't fraud. It was wonder, the kind that fills the gaps when knowledge hasn't caught up yet. And really, if you squint at a rhinoceros skull under candlelight, dragon isn't such a bad guess. The town that slept for 100 years. There was a medieval rumor about a French village that had fallen asleep for generations, a punishment, they said, for defying the church. No records ever proved it, but in the 20th century, archaeologists uncovered the ruins of an entire medieval settlement buried under layers of volcanic ash from an eruption around 1280. Everything, homes, loaves of bread, pottery, perfectly preserved. It hadn't slept, of course. It had simply been frozen in time. Still, the myth had captured the truth in its own strange way. A town once alive, then suddenly silent. Dreaming under the earth for centuries. The fish that was actually a bishop. This one's almost too ridiculous not to be true. Medieval sailors swore they once met a giant fish that resembled a man, dressed in a bishop's robes, and capable of giving a blessing before vanishing into the sea. It was dismissed for centuries as drunken hallucination, until naturalists identified a deep-sea creature called the sea bishop, or Rhina ancylostoma, a large, flat-headed fish with what genuinely looks like folded robes and a pointed mitre. Nature, as usual, had been doing performance art long before humans caught on. The castle that sank overnight. According to Breton legend, A castle called Curwys was swallowed by the sea in a single night after its gates were left open during a storm. A moral tale, supposedly, about sin and pride. But in the 1990s, marine geologists mapped the coast near Douarnenez and found the submerged remains of an early medieval settlement, stone walls, causeways, even a harbor, now resting beneath silt and sand. Not a castle exactly, but an entire town that had indeed been swallowed by the sea. And so the myth, as usual, had remembered what the maps forgot. The curse of the moving tomb. In a small English parish, a gravestone was said to shift positions each night, always found facing a different direction by morning. The villagers, predictably, assumed witchcraft. When the graveyard was surveyed in the 1800s, researchers discovered that the slab rested on a patch of unstable clay. The repeated freezing and thawing of the ground caused it to twist slightly over time, a slow geological dance mistaken for a haunting. So yes, the tomb really did move. Just not fast enough for the devil to take credit. The woman who turned to stone. Some medieval churches feature carvings said to be real people turned to stone as punishment for sin. It's pure folklore, usually. Except at St. Ositha's Priory, where a local woman named Agnes was rumored to have been transformed while mocking a procession. When her supposed statue was examined during renovation, it was found to contain remnants of human bone and hair embedded within the plaster, apparently made by pouring limestone over an actual corpse. The medieval sense of symbolism could be alarmingly literal. The plague doctor who survived everything. In Italy, stories circulated about a plague physician who never caught the disease, despite treating thousands. He was thought to have a charm from God. But recent study of his preserved garments revealed that his wax-sealed leather suit was so airtight it accidentally created an early form of biohazard gear, complete with a primitive respirator stuffed with herbs. He didn't survive through miracle. He survived through science, centuries early. Sometimes the line between legendary and accidentally brilliant is thinner than a stitch of waxed leather. The fairy rings that appeared overnight. Peasants used to whisper that the perfect circles of mushrooms in the woods were marks left by dancing fairies. To enter one was to vanish forever. And while the fairies may have been shy, the circles themselves are very real, caused by underground fungal growth expanding evenly outward. The result is a ring of mushrooms that grows wider every year. A quiet, scientific explanation, but still, if you see one glimmering in the moonlight, it's hard not to imagine something delicate spinning there, just beyond sight. The castle's eternal echo. One castle in Bohemia claimed that if you whispered your name in its great hall, it would echo back exactly 1 year later to the day. It sounds poetic, a bit too poetic, yet physicists studying the ruin found that its vaulted acoustics create an echo delay of roughly 8 seconds, enough to bounce back multiple layers of overlapping sound if repeated continuously. Over time, this could have been mistaken for a ghostly delayed reply. So yes, the castle really did talk back. Just not quite on schedule. The cat who served as a monk. At a monastery in Poland, records mention Brother Pounce, a cat allegedly assigned to official duty chasing mice from a library. For centuries, it was thought to be a joke. Then restorers discovered paw prints preserved in a 15th century manuscript's margin, right across a fresh line of ink. Beside them, a monk had written in Latin, "Cursed be the paws of the beast who walked across my work." So Brother Pounce, it seems, was real and left his autograph on history. The bells that rang by themselves. In a small Irish abbey, villagers once claimed that the church bells would ring at dawn even when no one was there. Centuries later, meteorologists studying old local reports discovered frequent tremors from a shallow fault line nearby. The vibrations were just strong enough to set the bells trembling. So the earth itself had been the bell ringer all along. A humble miracle of geology. The king's sleep that lasted forever. And finally, the legend of the sleeping king. All across Europe, variations existed: King Arthur, Emperor Frederick, Charlemagne, heroes sleeping in hidden caves, waiting to wake when the world needed them again. Naturally, no one ever found them. But recent archaeological digs in Germany uncovered burial chambers sealed so perfectly they preserved entire bodies, armored and seated upright on stone thrones, the origin, perhaps, of those sleeping king tales. They weren't waiting to rise again. They were simply resting very well. the quiet end. And that's where we'll leave them. The saints, the kings, the ghosts, and the cats. All half asleep somewhere in the long corridors of medieval memory. If there's one thing the Middle Ages teach us, it's that truth and legend were never enemies, just companions whispering to each other in the dark. Every myth had a memory behind it. Every miracle had a trace of reason. And sometimes, the most fantastic stories were the ones that turned out to be quietly, inconveniently true. So, as you close your eyes tonight, imagine those old candlelit halls, the echo of footsteps, the soft hum of prayers, the creak of wood and the flicker of a single light. The world outside has gone silent again. And maybe, somewhere, a monk still mutters in his sleep, a candle still burns, and a cat still pads softly across a parchment. Good night. And rest well, fellow traveler. We'll drift back through history again soon. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've made it this far, you've already wandered through saints, legends, and some mildly suspicious miracles. Now we're leaving the castles and cathedrals behind, and drifting down to the villages, to the quiet world of the people who never had chroniclers or heraldry, but who kept the entire Middle Ages running one salted fish at a time. So, get comfortable. Imagine the faint smell of wood smoke, the slow drip of brine in a barrel, and the peaceful thought that, if you'd lived back then, your winter survival depended entirely on how creative you were with salt, smoke, and mold. Because tonight, we're talking about medieval peasant food preservation hacks, the quiet, strange, sometimes unpleasant tricks that actually worked. The barrel of salt and hope. We'll start with salt, the true ruler of the Middle Ages. For most peasants, salt wasn't just seasoning. It was survival in mineral form. Meat, fish, even butter, everything went into barrels layered with rough gray salt crystals. A good salt barrel could keep pork edible for a year. A bad one could turn it into something that smelled like damp socks soaked in seawater. But here's the part that surprises most people. Medieval peasants knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't just throw meat in salt. They used ratios, about 1 part salt to 8 parts meat, and they understood that air contact ruined everything. So they filled gaps with melted fat or, if they couldn't afford that, with boiled water thickened with ash. Yes, ash. It kept mold from forming and bugs from nesting. They didn't have chemistry textbooks, but somehow they'd invented one of the oldest antibacterial sealing methods we still use, the alkaline barrier. The art of smoke. If salt was survival, smoke was flavor. Peasants didn't smoke food because they loved the taste, that came later. They did it because their homes were literally full of smoke already. Most medieval cottages didn't have chimneys. Smoke from the hearth rose to the roof and lingered, curling around beams and hanging meats. Over weeks, that slow exposure cured the meat, darkened it, and coated it in antimicrobial compounds. It wasn't a recipe, it was an accident. The first smoked hams in Europe probably started as forgotten hams left too close to the rafters. And as it turns out, creosote, the black, sticky stuff that collects in old chimneys, is an excellent preservative. So next time you see an artisanal smoked sausage in a modern shop, remember, its ancestor was just a peasant's emergency backup meal, flavored by centuries of soot. Pickling without knowing it. Pickling wasn't really pickling yet. Most peasants didn't own vinegar. But they did know that if you left cabbage or turnips in a brine long enough, something magical happened, the sour taste arrived on its own. That magic was lactic acid fermentation, the same process behind modern kimchi and sauerkraut. They didn't know bacteria existed, but they'd already mastered microbiology through observation. A wooden cask of salted cabbage buried in a cool corner could last all winter. And better yet, it kept people from dying of scurvy, even though no one had any idea what a vitamin was. So yes, the peasants who accidentally invented sauerkraut were unknowingly conducting biochemical experiments, just without the lab coats or the luxury of failure. Dried, not dead. Drying food sounds easy now, but in the medieval climate, cold, damp, and moody, it was an art form. Fruits were strung up near the rafters, meat laid on woven reeds by the fire. If mold appeared, they'd simply scrape it off, say a small prayer, and continue eating. Sun drying rarely worked in Northern Europe, so people got creative. They'd hang apple slices in the warm draft above ovens or spread berries on the lids of cooling bread, letting the leftover heat do the work. It was slow, uneven, and occasionally questionable, but it worked well enough to keep famine from knocking on the door quite so early. The eternal bread. Every household made bread. Not because they loved baking, but because bread was the safest way to store calories. A loaf could be dried into something that resembled a brick and kept for months. When it was finally needed, it was soaked in broth or ale until soft again. This was called sop, as in supper. Because in many homes, supper was literally just old bread soaked in something vaguely edible. Hard bread also had a strange advantage: rats hated it. So it doubled as both food reserve and pest deterrent. And yes, some medieval loaves have been found almost perfectly preserved, centuries later. Not because they were sacred relics, but because they were, quite simply, indestructible. So, now that we've wandered through the smoked meats and salt barrels of the medieval pantry, let's drift towards something even more alchemical. Fermentation. It's one of those things that feels oddly modern, the kind of process hipsters rediscovered in mason jars. But medieval peasants were already doing it, often out of necessity, not trend. If you couldn't afford salt, or firewood, or a dedicated smokehouse, you simply let nature do the work. You let cabbage rot, on purpose. You encouraged milk to separate into strange, bubbling layers. And you called it preservation. In small, dark cottages across England, Germany, and the Low Countries, crocks of fermenting vegetables sat in corners, quietly fizzing. They didn't smell great. Actually, some smelled alarmingly like feet that had gone on strike. But that scent meant life. It meant vitamins, lactic acid, and months of edible food. Cabbage was turned into sauerkraut. Turnips were pickled. Even leeks were submerged in brine, to be rescued later during the bleakest parts of winter. There's a rather gentle irony here. Peasants, often mocked for their dirty diets, were keeping themselves alive with one of the healthiest food preservation methods ever discovered, long before anyone could spell microbiome. And of course, there was beer. Beer was not really about enjoyment, at least, not at first. It was a method of purifying water. Medieval water, especially around towns, was less refreshing spring and more lightly seasoned with livestock. So peasants brewed what they called small beer. Weak, cloudy, and about as alcoholic as cough syrup. Even children drank it. Because, honestly, the beer was cleaner than the well. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Communities that brewed survived. Those that didn't, well, they spent a lot more time at funerals. Fermentation wasn't just for vegetables and drinks. People fermented fish. Yes, fish. In Scandinavia, they buried cod or herring in barrels with a sprinkle of salt and let it mellow. Sometimes for months. The result was a pungent delicacy, one that could make even a seasoned traveler cry politely at dinner. But again, it kept them alive. And here's the interesting part: the modern versions of those fermented dishes, like Swedish surströmming or Icelandic hakarl, are basically unchanged. Centuries later, people are still eating food that was originally invented to keep you from starving. That's what tradition really is: survival, dressed up as heritage. Let's drift now to another odd but clever trick: the butter vault. In Ireland and parts of Scotland, people sometimes buried butter in peat bogs. No, not metaphorically. Literally buried it. Wrapped it in animal hide or tree bark, dropped it in the cold, airless mud, and left it there for months or even years. Why? Because bogs were nature's refrigerators. Cold, damp, oxygen-free. The butter might come out brown and a bit leathery, but it was preserved. And oddly enough, archaeologists have actually found these butter bundles, thousands of years old, still faintly smelling like dairy. You could say that's disgusting. Or you could say it's an incredible success story in pre-modern food storage. Both would be true. Even fruit was given its own grim kind of immortality. Apples and pears were dried in low ovens or hung from rafters, slowly turning into wrinkled, leathery snacks. Berries were turned into dense pastes, known as fruit leathers. And honey, which never really goes bad, was the closest thing to medieval Tupperware. Honey sealed meat, preserved fruit, and treated wounds. It was both medicine and marinade, the medieval multitasker. Sometimes they even fermented it into mead, because of course they did. If something could bubble, it would eventually end up as alcohol. So much of medieval life was about staying one step ahead of decay. And in a way, the peasants won that quiet war. Their larders were smoky, sour, sticky, and deeply unappetizing by modern standards. But they had figured out the rhythm of nature, the art of waiting, of patience, of letting time itself do the cooking. And though they didn't know the words bacteria or fermentation, they understood something much more useful. That life and rot are often the same process, viewed at different speeds. Let's drift gently onward, from the world of cabbage jars and smokehouses to something a little more delicate. The symbolic side of food. Because medieval people didn't just eat for survival. They ate for meaning. And the way they stored, shared, and blessed their food was part ritual, part science, and part superstition. That's where we'll go next. To the strange, reverent relationship medieval people had with what they ate, and how they believed food could shape the soul. So now, we've salted, smoked, and buried our food in the ground. It survived winter, rats, and the occasional hungry neighbor. But for medieval people, that wasn't quite enough. Because food wasn't only about keeping the body alive. It was about keeping the soul in balance too. Every loaf of bread, every egg, every jar of ale came wrapped in layers of meaning. And to eat without the proper respect, well, that was practically inviting trouble. Bread, for example, was not just bread. It was the staff of life. That phrase wasn't poetic, it was literal. For peasants, bread was the single most important part of their diet, often half their calories for the entire year. And it carried a sort of quiet holiness. People crossed the loaf before cutting it. They would never place it upside down, that was considered bad luck, and frankly, a bit blasphemous. If a crumb fell to the floor, it was picked up carefully and kissed. Bread was tied so deeply to divine imagery that wasting it was almost a sin. And of course, this was reinforced every week at church, where bread stood in for something far greater. So, every time a medieval peasant sliced into their rough brown loaf, they weren't just having lunch. They were performing a small act of devotion. The kitchen itself was also a sacred space, though it didn't always smell like one. Between the smoke, tallow, and fermented cabbage, holiness had to fight for its place. But still, certain acts were marked with ritual. When women baked, they sometimes made the sign of the cross in the dough. When a pot first began to boil, it was common to whisper a prayer, not for flavor, but to keep evil spirits from entering the meal. Because, naturally, if your soup spoiled, there had to be someone to blame. And invisible demons were much easier to accuse than your husband who forgot to chop the onions. Salt, too, was powerful. It was expensive, yes, but also symbolic. It preserved against rot and corruption, so people believed it could preserve the soul as well. Monks wrote prayers about salt. Priests blessed it. And it wasn't just for the table. Salt was sprinkled on newborns to protect them from the devil. It was buried in the corners of houses to guard against witches. And of course, if you spilled it, you threw some over your shoulder. Because superstition doesn't need a reason, just good aim. Eggs were another quiet miracle. To the medieval mind, they represented rebirth, creation, and the mystery of life, long before pastel Easter baskets came along. On Holy Thursday, people boiled and blessed eggs, keeping them through the year as good luck charms. Sometimes they'd even bury an egg at the threshold of a new home, hoping it would bring fertility and peace. And if it exploded later, well, perhaps the neighbors had been too nosy with their spells. Then there were the food taboos. Entire sets of unwritten rules about what one should and shouldn't eat. Fish on Fridays. No meat during Lent. And certain animals, especially those with unusual habits, were treated with suspicion. Owls, bats, hedgehogs, all avoided. Cats? Definitely not. Unless you were French, and very hungry, and pretending it was rabbit. Even cooking itself had a strange, sacred rhythm. Before the first fire was lit, some cooks would mark the hearth with ash in the shape of a cross. If a pot boiled over, they whispered apologies to the household spirits, small, unseen beings thought to live behind the stove. These spirits had many names: brownies, kobolds, domovoi. They were half helpful, half mischievous, like tiny kitchen landlords. If you treated them kindly, they'd keep your bread from burning. If not, well, you might wake to find your porridge on the floor. Medieval people, for all their hardships, lived in a deeply enchanted world. Everything had meaning. A loaf of bread could bless or curse. A pinch of salt could guard a soul. And the simple act of cooking dinner could become a quiet conversation with the divine. Even the most ordinary act, like boiling cabbage, carried whispers of magic. A connection to nature, to faith, and to fear. And when you think about it, that's what made their world feel so alive. Even as they faced famine and plague, they believed that meaning could be found in every meal, if you were humble enough to look for it. Let's drift now toward the final part of our evening. We've followed the peasants through winter, through hunger, and through their strange rituals of food and faith. But there's one more part of this story that deserves a little light before we end the night. The last, quiet miracle of medieval food preservation, how it shaped community. Because, in the end, survival wasn't just about salt or smoke. It was about sharing. So next, we'll wander into the soft hum of the village itself, the feasts, the charity loaves, the little acts of kindness that kept people alive when everything else failed. By now, our medieval pantry is full, or at least, as full as survival allows. There's smoked pork hanging from the rafters, dried apples in cloth sacks, and a suspiciously burbling jar of something cabbage-related in the corner. But none of it means much if you have to eat it alone. Because food, in the Middle Ages, wasn't just something you consumed. It was something you shared. And sometimes, that sharing made the difference between life and death. The medieval village wasn't a place of abundance. It was a place of rhythm, of enough, sometimes barely. When harvests were good, everyone celebrated together. When they were bad, everyone suffered together. There was a kind of unspoken economy of kindness. If your neighbor's cow died, you might lend them milk. If your bread rose well, you gave the first loaf away. Because everyone knew, next year, it could be you staring at an empty pot. It wasn't charity, exactly. It was more like insurance. Human insurance, paid in small, edible installments. And then there were the great feasts, those rare, luminous interruptions in a year of repetition. They weren't just about gluttony or celebration, they were a way of reaffirming that the village was still whole. When the lord of the manor threw a feast, it wasn't entirely generosity. It was a performance of care. A public reminder that he, theoretically, protected and provided. And for the peasants, it was a day to eat meat without guilt, or a knife fight over who got the last piece of mutton fat. At harvest festivals, people sang, drank small beer, and roasted whatever they could spare. Sometimes, they made huge communal stews, pottage, cooked in cauldrons big enough to feed an entire field's worth of workers. Each family brought a handful of something, a carrot, a bone, a pinch of barley. No one quite owned the meal. It belonged to the season. Even famine had its strange etiquette. When times were truly bad, when the grain rotted in the field, or when locusts came, villages didn't completely collapse into chaos, as one might imagine. They improvised. They dug roots, boiled weeds, and made a grim kind of soup from grass and bark. And when that failed, they knocked on doors. There was shame in begging, yes. But there was also duty in feeding the hungry. Many manors and monasteries kept alms loaves, bread baked specifically for the poor. Some abbeys distributed these every day, others only on feast days. And for the peasants who lived on the knife's edge, those loaves were a kind of divine ration, part grace, part social welfare. Monks, especially, played a quiet role in feeding the forgotten. Their refectories were plain, their meals simple, but their stores, surprisingly vast. They kept fish ponds, smokehouses, and vegetable gardens that could supply entire villages in lean years. And though not every monk was saintly, the structure of monastic life encouraged sharing. You couldn't hoard food if your vow of poverty forbade it. So, the surplus flowed outward, to travelers, to peasants, to the sick. It's one of the overlooked truths of medieval history. While kings fought wars over thrones, monks quietly kept thousands alive with pickled turnips and salted carp. Even the calendar itself revolved around food sharing. Holy days, feast days, fast days, all marked not just time, but nutrition. During Lent, meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed. So, people shared what fish they could find. During harvest festivals, people shared bread, beer, and blessings. And during famine, they shared silence, waiting together for the next miracle of rain. There was a deep understanding that food was never just yours. It was part of the village's balance, a rhythm of taking and giving that kept the world from collapsing into hunger and suspicion. And of course, even nobles, those so often detached from reality, recognized the symbolism of feeding others. Royal banquets were excessive, yes. Dozens of dishes, strange meats, sugar sculptures shaped like castles. But they weren't purely indulgent. They were public theater, edible propaganda. Feeding guests showed power. Feeding the poor showed mercy. Doing both showed legitimacy. Kings understood that keeping your people alive, even symbolically, was good politics. Because no crown, however shiny, looks dignified next to a starving peasantry. Still, the true heart of medieval food wasn't found in the castle or abbey. It was found in the small, smoky cottages, where women stirred the same pot every day, where scraps were saved, bones boiled twice, and meals stretched across the week like a fragile thread. Dinner wasn't about variety or flavor, it was about endurance. It was the daily ritual of survival, performed in quiet partnership with nature and neighbor alike. You shared because you had to. You shared because you might need sharing returned. And in that exchange, between hunger and generosity, the medieval world held itself together. So when we imagine the Middle Ages as grim and isolated, maybe we miss something important. The people who lived then didn't survive because of kings, or battles, or divine miracles. They survived because someone, somewhere, ladled them a bowl of soup. And in the cold months, when the days were short and the fire low, that might have been the closest thing to love that history ever recorded. Let's drift, now, toward the closing embers of our journey. We've traveled from smokehouses to sacred kitchens, from salt barrels to shared stews. But there's one final thought before we let the night end. Not about food itself, but about what it meant. How, through all the superstition, hunger, and decay, medieval people still managed to make eating feel like grace. So in our final part, let's let the light fade completely, and think quietly about how the act of preserving food became an act of preserving hope. By now, the fire in the peasant cottage is only a faint shimmer under the ashes. Outside, the wind has gone still. And in the silence, you can almost hear the soft creak of a wooden beam, the whisper of straw shifting in the loft above. This is what the end of a medieval day sounded like. No machines, no roads, no glowing windows on distant hills. Just the small, tired world of survival, and the quiet triumph of having made it through another day. For the medieval poor, every meal was a kind of prayer answered. Every scrap of bread, a small victory against time, weather, and chance. When they salted pork, they weren't thinking about next month. They were thinking about next week. When they dried apples or buried butter, it wasn't luxury, it was a small, desperate insurance policy against the cold. And yet, in their patient way, they turned that daily struggle into something resembling grace. They learned to trust in slow miracles, in fermentation, in faith, in one another. They didn't need science to explain why bread rose, or why beer fizzed. They just needed it to keep happening. And somehow, it did. It's easy, from the comfort of our century, to see the Middle Ages as dark. And they were, often literally. Cottages were dim. Winters were long. Plagues came and went like storms you couldn't predict. But if you look closely, there's a soft, persistent light underneath all that shadow. It's in the rituals we've drifted through tonight, the small gestures that turn survival into something sacred. A loaf marked with a cross. A pinch of salt tossed into a boiling pot. A bowl of soup shared with a hungry neighbor. Tiny things, almost invisible. And yet they held entire worlds together. Preservation, in the medieval sense, wasn't just about keeping food from rotting. It was about refusing to let despair set in. Because when you're surrounded by uncertainty, when famine, plague, and war hover just outside the door, the act of saving something, anything, becomes an act of hope. To dry fruit was to believe in winter's end. To smoke meat was to imagine a future meal. To brew beer was to assume you'd still be around to drink it. Every jar, every cask, every buried butter bundle was a quiet message sent forward in time, from a frightened, resourceful peasant to the person they hoped to still be, a few months later. That, in its own small way, was faith. And there's something almost beautiful in that, how they learned to live in partnership with decay itself. They didn't defeat rot or mold. They made peace with it. They invited it in, tamed it, turned it into flavor. Modern people refrigerate everything to keep life sterile and controlled. Medieval people, without knowing it, created the first form of biological collaboration. They were the original microbiologists, just without the microscopes. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That a medieval woman stirring a bubbling pot of ale might have had more in common with a modern scientist than with the noblewoman in her local castle. Both were trying to understand what makes life last a little longer. Both were, in their own way, trying to preserve hope. And when winter finally broke, when spring crept back over the hills, and green shoots began to appear again, it must have felt like waking up from a long, heavy sleep. The smoked meats would come down from the rafters. The last of the pickled turnips would be finished. And new milk, new bread, new beer would replace the old. The cycle continued. Life went on, soft and stubborn. Because that's the secret the medieval peasants knew, one that still applies now. You don't need comfort to find peace. You just need rhythm. A pattern. Something to do with your hands that tells your heart to keep waiting. Even the great cathedrals, with all their gold and glass, were really monuments to the same idea. That the world is fragile, but worth preserving anyway. Every brick laid, every prayer whispered, every loaf baked, they were all acts of defiance against the inevitable. To live, to preserve, to keep, even when everything seems temporary. That was the true medieval miracle. And so, as we leave the Middle Ages behind tonight, as the last candle fades and the fields fall silent, maybe take a quiet moment to think of those nameless hands that kept the world turning. They didn't write their stories. They didn't lead armies or build empires. But they salted the meat, turned the milk, stirred the pots. They kept life alive, one day at a time. And in that small, humble way, they preserved not just food. They preserved us. So close your eyes now. Let the smoke drift away. Imagine the scent of warm bread, the creak of the old cottage, the low hum of a world that refused to stop. Because somewhere, deep in that quiet medieval night, the embers still glow. And the story, somehow, still goes on.